Hi, AP Lang. So I know you all are getting ready for your first discussions and writing some of your discussion questions, and I just wanted to give you a little bit of guidance to help you on that process. So to start, I gave you all this document, and I think it might be a little bit overwhelming, and I don't expect you to internalize everything that's in the document for I don't expect you to find all of those things or look for all of those things in the section that you're focusing on. I just kind of dumped everything that you could think about or look for based on your skill category into that document. So please don't get overwhelmed by that. And you don't need to read the book with that document open and kind of go back and forth constantly. The way that I would suggest using this is just kind of looking through, especially this look for section at the top. And then looking through the kinds of questions that AP kind of expects you to ask about a text before you start reading, and then you read your section with that as sort of like your lens that you're reading the section through. So in the process of writing discussion questions, it's okay if you don't use the language from the key questions document. I'm just kind of talking through this stuff here. I want that to help you kind of, again, give you that lens as you're reading, but then the way that you write your discussion questions will be driven by what stands out to you. So if you know you're focusing on style, you know you're looking for word choice and sentence structure, you might be looking for comparisons and figurative language and rhetorical devices, but really you're just trying to notice what stands out to you as something that is weird or seems important. And you don't really understand why O'Brien wrote that part that way. That is the making of a great question. So I've got an example here. In the first story, The Things They Carried, he talks about Martha, Lieutenant Cross, who is in love with Martha, and we get a whole lot of information about Martha. So you might come up with the question, what's the deal with the whole Martha story? Why is that included? And that might sound like it's not a very academic question, or it's not a good question for discussion, but it's actually a great discussion question because it allows us to think about claims that he's making, like what is Martha evidence of for Lieutenant Cross when we're thinking about love, when we're thinking about war and escape and love versus obsession, and there's a lot of things that O'Brien might be saying or claims that he might be making with the Martha story. So if you were to include a question like that, it does allow your group to talk about claims and evidence. It allows your group to talk about rhetorical situation, because obviously the whole Martha story is a situation that deals with emotions, and it makes you kind of feel emotions. When I read the book the first time, the emotion I felt was kind of like repulsion. Like Lieutenant Cross just kind of seemed like a weirdo and a creepy dude to me, but it made me feel something, and it made me react emotionally to a character. So that has to do with pathos, the rhetorical situation, the impact on the audience. It allows us to think about how we have these lists of things, just lists of things these men are carrying. So exemplification, it's a rhetorical mode. But then suddenly we have these narratives about Martha and playing volleyball and holding hands and whether he's going to put his hand on her knee. So that's kind of that line of reasoning piece, like why do we have this weaved in story of Martha and what effect does that have? And it also allows us to look at word choice. When we think about the Martha story, if that's like a weird thing that stands out to us, like I don't know why he would write it that way, then we can zoom in and look at the word choices, the phrases that he uses to describe her, and then that kind of connects back to the style lens as well. So that beginning part is just to say, trust your intuition, because you're probably noticing things as you read that do connect back to your skill category, and write questions about those things that make you curious, those particular parts. And then this next part is just some tips for writing a strong discussion question. So start questions with how, why, or what is the purpose of, just kind of as a tip. You don't have to, but those usually make good discussion questions. If you're asking about a choice that the writer is making, connect it to a specific example. And I'm going to show you what that looks like in just a second. And then test your question. After you write it, you write your question and you're wondering, like, is this good? Put yourself in your lit circle's position and imagine that you heard that question and you're on a Zoom call and you've got your book ready, and like, are you going to be able to answer it after thinking about it for just a few moments? Are you going to be able to come up with an answer, and maybe there might be multiple right answers? So you want a strong discussion question to be open-ended, so it doesn't have like one correct answer, because that's the whole point of interpretation, is that we can go in different directions with it. And then also it's important to be specific enough in your question that people can hear your question and think about it, and maybe say, like, can you ask that one more time? Think about it some more, and then they're able to say something about it. So one example might be, how does O'Brien's syntax choices affect his overall argument? Okay, so we know he's making very clear decisions about how long his sentences are and how short his sentences are, and where he puts certain parts of certain sentences in relation to each other. But this question, I would feel stuck if I was in a discussion and my partner asked me this. I might say, like, oh man, that's a big question. I don't feel smart enough to answer that, like, in this moment. Like, I feel like I need to go back and spend a lot of time with the book. So it's a great question that we can make more focused. And one of the ways of doing that is ask about specific syntax choices. So you might talk about short and long sentences. And you could talk broadly about it. How does O'Brien use short and long sentences effectively? Or you could zoom in and say, I don't know if this is a mirror and if you will see this the right way or flipped backwards. But how does O'Brien's use of short and then long sentences on page 36 impact that part of the story he's telling? So that is about, it's about, Ted Lavender and the body bag. And so he says, like, I remember these things too. The damp fungal scent of an empty body bag, a quarter moon rising over the nighttime patties, Henry Dobbin sitting in the twilight, sewing on his new buck sergeant stripes, quietly singing a tisket, a tasket, a green and yellow basket. A field of elephant grass, weighted with wind, bowing under the stir of helicopters' blades, the grass dark and servile, bending low, but then rising straight again when the chopper went away. So we have this whole section that's like very short sentence moving into longer and longer sentences going down. So that's like one specific example, and we could say, like, we could ask the question, how does his use of those short and long sentences impact that part of the story? Or you could make it about a specific part of his argument. So why would O'Brien use really short sentences to talk about Ted Lavender's death on page 36? And what does his syntax make us feel or recognize here? Page 36 is that part up there where you have just these really short sentences, all their own paragraph as well. Okay, so that's a way that you can take like a broad question that might make people feel stuck and make it a little bit more specific so that people, your group members, can jump in and answer it. And I have a little bit more time in my video, so I am going to talk to you about my process of close reading and coming up with a discussion question, and also talk to you about one of the opening scenes that just shows that O'Brien is a brilliant writer. So when you start reading the book, very quickly you come to the Ted Lavender story, and the first place that we see him is on page 2. And it's this part where he says, O'Brien writes, Ted Lavender, who was scared, carried tranquilizers until he was shot in the head outside the village of Tonquay in mid-April. Okay, and that is kind of jolting to read about someone's death that way. And then we go on, and on page 3 it says, until he was shot, Ted Lavender carried 6 or 7 ounces of premium dope, which for him was a necessity. Again, okay, it's a weird way to talk about somebody's death. And then we get farther down on page 3, and it says, in April, for instance, when Ted Lavender was shot, they used his poncho to wrap him up, then to carry him across the paddy, then to lift him into the chopper that took him away. And so I know that I noticed this the first time I read this book. I know it made me feel uncomfortable. This is not the first time I've read it, and I'm annotating kind of intentionally looking for specific things. But I marked it, and then my process might be, I might kind of go from, that's a weird way to talk about a guy dying. Like, who was shot? Just like, it's an afterthought. Like, here's this character, and by the way, he died violently. And then my brain might, if my lens is syntax and I'm focusing on sentence structure, I might go to, oh, this has something to do with the way that the phrases are arranged inside the sentence. So like, his death is put in there, kind of like tucked into the sentence, but it's not the main idea. And then I might that might lead me into writing the question, why does O'Brien talk about Ted Lavender's death only in subordinate clauses? So if I'm like a grammar champion, I might ask it that way and say like subordinate clauses. But if I don't know that language and that's not available like right at the tip of my tongue, I might say, why does O'Brien talk about Ted Lavender's death like it's an afterthought? Or why does O'Brien introduce Ted Lavender's death the way he does? And that question allows us to talk about syntax, and it allows us to look at that. And as a quick grammar lesson, we didn't have a chance to really delve into subordinate and subordination and subordinate clauses, but we started talking about it a little bit before we all went home. But a cool thing to notice about this is that if you look for the subject and predicate of the main independent clauses in each of these 3 sentences that talk about Ted Lavender, our subjects and predicates of those sentences are Ted Lavender, our subject, carried tranquilizers, is our predicate. Ted Lavender carried 6 or 7 ounces of premium dope, so that's our main subject and predicate. And then they used his poncho. So those are the independent clauses in those sentences that talk about Lavender's death. The only places that talk about him actually dying are the subordinate clauses. And they're subordinate because we have these words, until and when, which are subordinating conjunctions or swabbies. So the only way that we ever are introduced to Ted Lavender being shot in the opening of the book, which it's kind of a jolting thing that we see there, is when his death is mentioned as not as the subject, but as an afterthought, as a subordinate, or as like a less important piece of information. It's less important than the fact that he carried tranquilizers. It's less important than the fact that he carried 6 or 7 ounces of premium dope. It's less important than the fact that they used his poncho to wrap him up and load him into the helicopter. So then we get to the question of like, why would O'Brien talk about a human being's death as less important than these other things, all these things that people are carrying and using? And I'm not going to answer that question for you because I think that could be discussed on end and again and could lead to a lot of really cool insights of your own. So I hope the video was helpful and you were able to see, understand the process of writing questions and how they lead us to greater insights about the book. Training your brain to think this way through the process of reading this book is going to make you so sharp in any kind of rhetorical, critical reading, close reading that you're doing, including and not limited to the FRQ rhetorical analysis on the exam. So, hope you all are having a great day.